Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Token Podcast. I'm your host and sometimes referee, Zach Stat Pearson, and today I'm joined by he who loves horror, he who has shaped his soul around that which gives all of us fear, and of course, anything involving a slasher fic, if not Evil Dead itself. Scott Bradley.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Zach, for such a wonderful opening. I've never had one quite like that, so that's wonderful, and I'm pleased to be on this show.
Yeah, all right. Well, let's get into it. First and foremost, what's your most recent book about, and what would you like for readers to learn or feel from your book that you didn't already kind of sort of state?
Well, my most recent book, I basically do this storyline where I want people to take a look at the way that horror can be as beneficial as any other way that we look to help ourselves on that internal journey that we've got. I look at like what Carl Jung talked about with the shadow self. We have the personae, which is me having a nice smile, trying to be friends. Yeah, right. And then we get to the point where there's the shadow self. And the shadow self is this primal thing that's inside of all of us. It's that animalistic, it's that dark side. And we all have it. And what Jung would talk about is that it is something that needs to be taken and given attention. A lot of us try to pretend that we don't have it, or we ignore it because it's not always wonderful to look at that side of us. But he says, you can ignore the shadow self at your peril, because it will get your attention like a spoiled brat. And that's when people get divorced and they get caught up in, all sorts of schemes, and they end up on TMZ because they've not found an outlet for this thing that's inside of them. But for me, it really started early, where I was kind of in a traumatic childhood, and horror helped me get some control. So when I talk about what is inside of the book, it's taking a look at horror as more than just something that just scares you, right? It has a purpose. It's not something that you can put in any different situation. And I don't say that horror movies can cure your lumbago, or you should get off your meds and start watching Friday the 13th. But I say that it takes care of the small stuff inside of us that's hard to articulate, kind of like music. Music does this thing for us where if you hear one or two chords from your favorite song, you brighten up. You don't even have to know the words. It goes past the intellect. It goes right to this primal part of us and exercises some demons we don't even know how to talk to somebody about. I can go to a psychiatrist and he can go, "What's wrong with me? What's wrong with you?" And I'll go, "Bleh. I don't know what to call the thing that's in me." But when I have horror movies, it just is able to let me have a sense of control in a world that is out of control. It's a dangerous world out there. It's a scary world out there. I have no control over what's going to happen, but I have control over this fear that I can have in a horror movie. If I hit pause, that's okay. But if I make it through, I feel like I've done something. And so it was a place where I could find some control. It also gave me a tribe, a group of people that felt like me. It let me look at a part of myself and realize that I wasn't that bad. And it gave me a sense of play. As you get older, you lose the sense of play. The world wants to make you serious, and you can't take this stuff that seriously. It always has a sense of I'm allowing this inner part of me, this child, to grow a little bit, to discover. And I think that one of the things that horror does really well is the power of allegory and metaphor, where you can have a parable. And I think horror is the second oldest story ever told around the campfire. The first one is, "Welcome, everybody. We love you. Thank you for being family. Thank you, gods, for giving us food and everything." And the second one is, "Don't go in the woods alone. You will die." And that is how we find our cautionary tale. And I think it's something that allows us to look at the monster without speaking the monster. And what I mean by that is monsters are metaphors. Every monster is a metaphor. It's standing in for something that we don't want to talk about, or something that is, if we talk about it, people might turn away from us. Politics, sexuality, whatever it might be. We might not want to talk about that directly, but a horror movie allows us to talk about it and not talk about it and get it. And so those are the kind of things that I mentioned in my book. Probably one of the first ways I got into horror. When I talked about a rough life in the beginning, I I grew up, my parents got in a fundamentalist cult that believed that the world was going to end in 1975, and that my responsibility was to save all of my friends by telling them to get rid of their religion, which was lying to them, and come to the truthful one that was based on math and shit. And it was just crazy living in that.
This literally just may be the best interview, and we're not even like halfway through it that's ever been done on this entire podcast. I'm gonna just call it right now.
Yeah, it was amazing, and they made me believe in demons. Like, demons are right here waiting for me to sin. I'm so damn important that the supernatural beings have to try and tempt me. But that was what I kind of grew up with.
What is more horrible than humanity? But since you've decided to segue us back that way, we're going to go to number 3 because technically you've answered number 2 twice, basically your father. What is your favorite horror movie and why? If that's even possible to figure out what your favorite one is, given that you're a connoisseur.
Yeah, thanks so much for saying if it's possible, because it's really, every time I'm asked that question, I die a little because it's like,
And some other movie you love. Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah. Yeah, there are all so many, they're like kids, but there's also, horror is such a wide umbrella. I still use the term horror. I'm not that big on saying anything more than subgenres after I say horror, like a slasher film and stuff like that. But I'm not big on like elevated horror. I'm not into post horror. I don't like these things that separate, because I think that that's almost like an elitist thing to do. It's kind of like the velvet rope. But I'll get to that. And why that becomes hard is that there's so many subgenres. If you ask me what my favorite zombie movie is, I could still only come up with maybe 2, because there's always an argument about that. But if you say my favorite horror movie of all time, it's really rough. I will say the one that probably got me into horror. In my book, I have this idea that I call the first kiss. The first kiss with horror isn't the first horror movie that you see. It's the first horror movie that impacts you. Like your first kiss, it can be ugly. It can be clumsy. It may not go the way you want. You might have nightmares for 3 days, but it's the movie that
totally
feels like
that to me.
Yeah, there you go, right? For me, it was something thoroughly unexpected. It's an art movie, and it was just because it was on HBO back when HBO was just starting out, so they would give it free to a bunch of places as a test audience thing to see if it would catch on. And I happened to be in the East Coast, and they were doing it around the tri-state area. I was in Pennsylvania, and just so happened I was in this area where they were showing stuff, and they would put anything on. They were like, "We don't have any standards. We're just trying to make it, and we're only on 8 hours a day." So they would put any kind of like exploitation film, action film. They have disaster movies, and one that they had on in the middle of the day was an R-rated horror movie called Don't Look Now. And it's a ghost story more than anything. But the first 5 minutes is infamous. People who have seen it will go, "Oh," because it was a movie that it was Christopher Nolan before there was Christopher Nolan. It was kind of like, I'm trying to think of other people who have like this really disturbing head trippy horror idea or science fiction idea. Yeah, so you had this thing where this child drowns in a pond at this family estate, and the parents are inside playing around with each other. But it's done in this way, in slow motion. It's done with premonition coming into it. It's done in nonlinear time, and it's shaky camera at certain points, and it's weirdly beautiful. And so when they find the daughter has drowned, there's a slow motion shot where the father comes up from under the water, and water's spraying in the air, and he's screaming, and his hair is matted over his face. All you can see is his mouth screaming, and that paralyzed me for like 3 days. For 3 nights, I couldn't tell my dad what was wrong, because I get my ass whipped for watching an R-rated HBO movie at 8. But I saw this thing, and it scared me to death. And I now realize, I mean, I didn't get it at that moment, that what scared me wasn't the girl drowned. It was the parents aren't going to save you. And that was important because my parents were secretly going through a very, very ugly and violent divorce. And I just knew my world was kind of falling apart. And so this movie spoke to me, even though I didn't know it was speaking to me. It also made me feel that if this could affect me, they don't make movies just for me. There must be other people in this pain boat too. And so I I needed to watch the movie again, even though it scared me to death, even though I had nightmares for 3 days. And then I felt a little bit better. I don't know if I would say stronger, but I felt like I had conquered something that really scared me in a world that was out of control. The big adults were changing my life. I had no say, and I didn't know what was going to happen. When you're an 8-year-old, you're like, what do they do? Leave me on the side of the road if mom and dad aren't together? What does that even mean? And so it was really a disturbing time of my life, well, along with being in a cult and all this shit. So horror just kind of landed right there. So if I had to say that was the most influential thing, was that movie got me into horror. Yeah, and the most influential that made me really say I can stay with horror forever was John Carpenter's Halloween. When that movie came
that's
out,
a classic. Even I've seen that one.
Oh yeah, I mean that's like a rite of passage, and I know it's slow and it's it's like a cliche-ridden thing. When it first came out, it wasn't. It kind of freed us from that. But the thing that made Halloween so good was that it was scary at the time, but it was also well made.
Okay, well, first and foremost, before we go into this next question, because I've asked this before, and I'm going to preface this by saying there is no wrong answers, and please don't look at me to help you alter or make a decision on it. But if horror movies were to become mainstream and started heavily saturating the market, would you consider that to be a good thing or bad thing, and why?
Oh, well, it's not like it hasn't happened before. I always wonder what saturate means when somebody asks me that, because the reality is, like, people ask, why isn't horror more popular? I'm like, have you ever looked at the box office? Every year, horror movies are $1 billion industry. There's a bunch of them, but they always sell. We have this thing, though, where we like to compartmentalize horror and put it on this spot. I don't think there's anything bigger than The Walking Dead for about 8 years. People who weren't into horror at all were watching this zombie soap opera, right? And The X-Files was huge. And these things are horror. And then we have, say, all the zombie movies that came out and stuff like that. So I think saturation is usually there. But I think I understand the question in the way that I used to talk about, like, heavy metal or punk rock back in the day, which is like, man, I love that band until it got popular and then it sold out. And I think that that's what we really talk about when we talk about horror becoming saturated in the market. We get half-assed horror movies. We get movies that are being made by people who aren't fans. And that happens to anything that becomes a trend. What's great about things that are kind of outsider art, if you want to call it that, is that it has its moment in the stars. Like after Jaws came out, after The Exorcist came out, horror movies were everywhere because they won Oscars. They were considered true art, and those movies were easy to imitate over and over and over again. We're still Sharknado and stuff. Jaws is from 1975. Yeah, I mean, all that shit is still out there. There's Shark. There's a million shark movies, and that movie is over 40 years old, almost 50 years old, for God's sake, and it's had that kind of impact. Well, the years from 1976 until, Star Wars takes over, but everything was killer sharks, killer dogs, killer bears, birds, everything was killing. Nature was killing everything. So horror has been super popular. It has saturated the market, and it dies out. The people who catch it as a fad, horror fans just have to kind of sit there and endure the time that it's that super big, and then it goes away. But it's not horror's fault. That's what we do in marketing. That's what we do with anything that we love. We kill everything we love through imitation. And so science fiction movies, I'm waiting for the Marvel thing to end, because it's gotten to a point now where it's so saturated that it's almost as if we're back to being comic book kids, where you needed to invest in 10 different storylines to understand the big story. You couldn't just watch a movie. The movie wasn't just that. It wasn't a complete beginning, middle, and end for 2.5 hours. Now it's like, wow, if you have to watch Doctor Strange to understand what's happening over here. So at some point that's going to burn out, because it's gotten so big and it's gotten so immersive that sooner or later someone's going to go, what the fuck are we doing? And everybody's going to go, you know what? I've been thinking that for about a decade myself. It's time to go back to
So many salty people once they hear that. Don't get me wrong. Like I mentioned,
Yeah.
I do enjoy differences of opinion, but I'm glad you said it, not me. I have a slightly different position on it. I knew from the beginning, the minute Avengers made $1 billion, Disney was not going to stop.
That's the thing. I mean, I'm loving everything that you're saying because just because I think that the bubble's going to break on this thing, it doesn't mean that I'm not a huge fan. I mean, this is like when I was a kid, I was in Silver Comics, Silver Legacy. That age was mine.
Moving into our next question before we get on a Marvel tangent. All right, so the next question is, are there any cases of written horror that you think translated well into movie or television format? And if so, can you name a few recommendations? And no, that's not a personal question for me, although I do try to look for horror TV shows because The Walking Dead woke something up in me. It didn't make me like lust for horror, but it made me interested in having a show where there is actually mortality for the main cast. Like, you don't know who's going to make it episode to episode. And I've only been able to find it in horror shows, but I don't know where any of them are.
Yeah, that and Game of Thrones. Walking Dead and Game of Thrones are the ones that have the best version of anybody can die at any time. That it enriches the storyline because horror movies essentially are always talking about how life is precious. How do we show that life is precious? Because there's a threat to it. And you can make it to the morning. So many horror movies are about just make it to dawn, man. Just make it to dawn. And that's metaphoric in and of itself. So when we see shows that take heroes and destroy them in a way, have them die, that is a sobering thing, but it's also making, it inadvertently shows us how precious life is. When horror fans cry when a favorite character dies or they're ready to, protest because of it, that is a sign of humanity. That we actually have a humane part of us, that we still care, that we can become attached. And so I think that's one of the positives that people don't usually look at. But yeah, when you talk about shows or books and movies or shows working on them, I have an entire chapter called Big Bad Books in my book, and it's about the thing that happens with books, and that's where I basically say that my first co-conspirator, that my corruptor, was a book, because I could read someone being eviscerated while I was on the bus, and no one knows. I can't watch a horror movie and start screaming and stuff. People will look at me, but when I'm reading, I could be reading anything. And so what I say in the book and what I say about this kind of thing is that it's not always the case, but a lot of times books that aren't great make great movies. They take the seed of what was really good in the book and they are able to elongate it. Or you have something where there are occasional books where the movie is nothing like the book, but the book is great and the movie is great. The Shining is one that comes to mind. The Shining movie has nothing to do with the Shining book. The Shining book, on the other hand, is really good. And it's scary.
I get it, because I didn't actually know that, and I didn't perceive The Shining as a horror movie. Although my heart jumps a little bit when I see twins walking down the hall, but that doesn't happen. Right. Obviously, they're twins. But I'm gonna look for the book now.
Yeah, the book is completely different than the movie. The movie goes down an entirely different path of a ghost story. The book is more like, this is an evil place that brings evil people to it. And so it's really kind of cool in that way. The Birds, the old Alfred Hitchcock movie with the birds. The book is actually a novella. It's a shorter book, is darker, way darker than the movie. And the movie's pretty bleak. I love that movie because even though it's super old and the people are kind of fucked up, it's kind of sexist in ways, the idea is so pure. They never tell you why the birds are doing what they're doing. And it's such a weird thing. Like, why would birds be scary? But all you have to do is one day walk in a park and have all these birds fly out of a tree and you didn't know one was in there, but there were 100 birds in there. And you start to go, man, they own the sky. If this did go bad, what would you do? Yeah, you could shoot at them, but there's millions of them. And that's what's scary about zombies, right? Whether they're fast moving zombies or slow moving zombies, it's the numbers game, right? They're going to get you. So the Shining's one. Jaws is a terrible book. It's a shitty book, but it made a really good movie. So they took the bones of the story and said, we can make something really good out of this. And so the thing that you get is a monster movie where they have the entire ocean is the place underneath your bed, right? We worry about where our legs are kicking. When we're up in the ocean, no big thing, but what's happening under the water is always something that's an anxiety point. And so that worked really well. I think Interview with a Vampire was a really good adaptation of a really good book. And so sometimes those things do work together. Haunting of Hill House, a great old story by Shirley Jackson about a bad place that attracts people, the weak and the evil. And there's a mini series on not HBO, on Netflix, The Haunting of Hill House, which is fantastic. And it has a little bit of that thing that you were talking about where you're not sure who might get off. Do you know somebody's going to get off? Yeah. And I'm trying to think of some other ones, but there's plenty of the original Pet Sematary. I hated the remake of Pet Sematary.
So often from horror people.
And the new movie is, oh, well, he's kind of put upon because he's got a harpy wife that believes in God and he doesn't believe in God. And she's insisting everything is not his fault in the new movie. It's a bro movie. It's made for bros. No, it's not our fault. Bitches are the problem. It's that. I was watching it going, you're kidding me. The cautionary tale, the story that had the courage to talk about that kind of toxic masculinity has now been cut. And so that's why I hate the new Pet Sematary. The new Pet Sematary makes it like, no, Lucas Creed is a nice guy. No, he's not. He's the problem. Right.
All right. So, and this is this is possibly the question I was most interested in the most about having an answer. Everyone and their mom knows who Stephen King is. And if you don't, you are not from North America. But are there any horror writers and directors you think people should be looking into? And what are some of the recommendations from them and their catalog? Doesn't matter if it's film or a book.
I'm going to mix it up a little bit with those. And I think, and I also want to bring in like documentary or things about horror. So I don't know if you've seen this, but Robin Means Coleman and Tananarive Due are two writers, African-American writers who wrote a book. One of them wrote a book about Black horror called Horror Noir. And the other teaches studies on Black horror, I think at UCLA. I had them on my podcast when their Shudder documentary came out. I highly recommend the book. I highly recommend the documentary if you haven't seen it, which basically...
get the name from you later once this is over, because I do want to see
it. Oh, it's fantastic. Basically, they start it by saying... the Black community has always loved horror movies, but horror movies have not always loved us. And it opened my eyes to several things that I didn't really notice. One of which was how Black characters were in horror movies in the 30s and 40s. They didn't have great roles, but they were in there. But they went invisible. They weren't in horror movies at all in the 50s. And that was because horror movies went after World War II. They started going to science gone out of control. So the main characters wore white lab coats and were scientists. And the mindset of the writers and directors in Hollywood at that time were, well, there are no Black scientists. So they never even thought of it. And it was like by occupation, there was erasure. And so it's a really, really, really good documentary, and it puts a frame of thought into movies that I've loved for a long time and made me look at them again. And that brings me to some movies that might be of interest to you. Ganja and Hess, which I don't know if you've heard of. It's from the 70s, and it's a movie about vampirism. It's basically about someone who's Black who makes money, moves into a neighborhood, and he starts to lose his soul. Starts to lose who he was to be able to assimilate into this new culture that he's in.
Literally, they use people like that, and they're all assholes.
Yeah. And so that's Ganjan Hess is a really interesting horror movie, and it talks about how we lose ourselves to money, how we assimilate ourselves into a culture just because. And it also talks about Candyman and saying Candyman's interesting, but he's also very problematic. Why in the fuck is Candyman, if he's for Cabrini Green, he's a boogeyman for the black people? Why isn't he attacking the white people? why is he attacking people in the slums? That doesn't make any sense. And yeah. And so there's this whole thing that they talk about where the new Candyman makes sense. Yeah. I love the new Candyman because it did something that I've always, when I'm asked what scares me, which is always another problematic story.
I learned to stop.
I always say,
because it usually just turns into literally like something that you're allergic to, not what scary thing you like in a book or movie. Plus, that usually gets answered throughout the course of an interview anyway.
Yeah, and so scary, the scariest kind of horror movies to me are ghost stories and possession movies. Possession movies because of my past. It's still somewhere deep down, even though, I don't believe like I used to believe anything like that, there's still a part of me that has not been erased that says, what if they're right? And demon movies scare me. Ghost stories are scary for the first 2 acts. And then it's like small claims court of the supernatural.
Okay. That is definitely, man, you've given me so many things. I'm typing half the stuff as you say because I'm going to look at some of this later. All right, but going into our penultimate question, which this is the first. Okay. This was going to be the first question, but I literally moved it down because I thought, man, that's going to be an interesting one. Should pornography be considered its own genre, or do you feel as if it's not worthy of separation from horror?
Well, I don't know if worthy has anything to do with it. I'm a firm believer that labels should only be on medicine, poisons. Like if you take it, you could die. I have I have an entire show that I do called my Horror Manifesto. And it's basically talking about why is it so hard to say horror? Why are there so many movies that steal horror ideas, are horror movies, but once they get to Oscar time, they're suddenly turned into thrillers like Jaws and like Silence of the Lambs, and even movies that don't seem initially like horror movies, then you really look at them like No Country for Old Men. These are horror movies that turn themselves, because once they get prestige, the word horror is a dirty word.
Yeah, I hate that.
And so
I know about the book a little bit. I didn't get to finish it, but the movie No Country for Old Men, for me, like, I didn't know that it wasn't considered a horror movie because what happens in it? There's an assassin trying to murder people, and he's also he has a psychological defect.
Yeah, he is unstoppable. He is fate. What do we have? Anytime someone goes outside the lines, this specter appears who can't be killed. Sugar. And he's everywhere. He's perfect as an assassin. He has no empathy. He is plain. He is dressed so that he can blend in with everybody, and yet he's a monster.
Books, I don't know if you read it or not, but did you read the book?
No, I didn't read the book.
Well, there's not much to spoil, but he's scarier in the book because Anton Sugar was the everyman, but in the most boring sense. He was a blonde, blue-eyed man who had no features that were too pretty, no features that were too ugly. He could literally walk in a crowd of hundreds of people who looked at him and they couldn't remember his face. That scared me more than the actual person that they chose to play him, because if I saw him walking down the street, I was like, man, that's a scary guy. I'm not going to fuck with him. But if I saw Anton Sugar in the book, he could kill me immediately because I would walk past him not thinking that he's even out for blood, and boom, next thing you know, my corpse is on the ground.
Oh, yeah. Now, the book that, so Cormac McCarthy wrote No Country for Old Men. He also wrote Blood Meridian, which is a Western horror movie. But nobody's been ever able to make it because it's so violent that no one has been able to figure out, how do we make this movie work? How could we make this book work, this movie?
So many things after this. I didn't know that there was a Western horror movie, and I'm not saying that hyperbolically. I'm being literal. I didn't know anybody mixed the two.
Yeah, it's a horror novel, but there are Western horror movies, and I'm drawing a blank right now, but I will come up with a few by the time this is over, because the idea of the death of the Old West, the old cowboy and Indian idea, was a ghost story horror movie allegory. You know, the idea of the other. You can't get much more horror than these things. The Wind is a really good Western horror movie. Eyes of Fire is another one where they take the metaphor of colonialism, right? You're colonizing this place. You're killing everything that you're going to. And the nature starts to come after the people. The spirits of the natives start coming after the people. It's pretty good stuff. But anyway, Cormac McCarthy writes amazing horror novels that win awards. And Blood Meridian is one. The Road, which was turned into a movie, which is an apocalyptic thing with a son and that's, cannibals walking the earth and all of this stuff. That's all that's left. Cormac has a dark presence, and he's one of the people that I would put as what you asked before about novelists. But anyway, I don't want to go too far off the thing. I'm not sure if I know what gornography is, because I don't really
it's the belief that any horror movie that profusely and obsessively shows and is dictated to have body horror and the showing of internal organs to the actual camera and on the screen is in and of itself, quote unquote, gornography. It's literally horror that is predicated on abuse and almost oversaturation of showing the human body mutilated as well as the organ.
Right. So we used to call that splatter back in the day. There were splatter films and there were slasher films. Slasher films were more knifey. Yeah, but gornography, that sounds like an opinion, is what it sounds like. It sounds like calling something pornography, which was kind of one of the things that happened with pornography. There was an old Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who said, I know it when I see it, which means it's thoroughly subjective. And I think that horror is thoroughly subjective. What scares you may not scare me. What scares me might put someone else into a coma. And that is the great thing about it as well, is that it is truly something that we can maybe not agree on what we like, but we can understand each other and share how these things affect us. And so it sounds like it is a subgenre of its own, I guess, gornography, but it sounds like that's somebody who's not a horror fan defining what they dislike about horror. What I find is that when I talk to people about horror, if I'm talking to someone who's a fan of horror movies, I'll talk to them for about 20 minutes. If I'm talking to someone who doesn't like horror movies, we talk about 20 minutes. And that's because everybody has an opinion and it's very, very passionate about it. There's something personal. There's something vulnerable about horror that talks about a part of us that sometimes you're not very pleased about. And I find that people who are not horror fans tend to define the entire genre, which has so many umbrellas, by the movie that they hate. They saw something that disgusted them. Yeah, it's a blanket statement. So I'm not a fan of gornography just from hearing it, because it sounds like pornography, which means that it's denigrating it. It's also saying that pornography is somehow a denigrating thing. I think there are pornographic films that are I can't think of a good word. Don't want to use evil because that's so Old Testament. But I think that there is a place for erotica. And I think there is a place for horror. But there are also versions of those that are reprehensible. There are horror movies I wish I never saw. Yeah, depravity. So there is depravity in these things. There's depravity in dramas. Welcome to Birth of a Nation. There can be movies that are prestige films that show a terrible mindset of a time, that when we watch them 30 years later, we go, holy shit, we should hold our heads in shame that we ever thought these things.
Context is key.
We kill what we have no empathy for. It's easy to kill comic book characters, not human beings. So that's that's what I call depravity. So if you have a movie, and there are movies like this, there are horror movies where it's just somebody tied to a chair and they're cutting pieces off of them, and it's all for the special effect. gore freaks, gore hounds. That does happen. Yeah. But my issue is, the question is never really about those. The question is, why are there horror movies? Why don't we consider horror movies lower life forms, lower entertainment, the lowest common denominator? It's really a denigration of, how could you watch those things? And that's what I always say. Why can't we just say horror? And why I dislike labels like post horror. I don't understand what post horror is. Yeah, I know. I don't like horror movies, but I like this movie, so it's not a horror movie. Why? Because I don't like horror movies. But the reality is, they don't like horror movie fans.
You definitely. I don't know if you or how your booking agent handles travel, especially given the world has cooties right now. But if you ever get a chance to go to C2E2, I'm pretty sure you can get panels. Moving into our ultimate topic, do you think the lack of interest for the average moviegoer not wanting to see this genre, as in horror, may be due to lack of supposed A-list talent being booked in these films, or just because they don't like the idea of being scared?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's one of the things that I love to say is that horror is much more popular than people like to say it is. All you have to do is look at Box Office Mojo and take a look at what the highest grossest films are. And in any year, horror movies, in fact, during this pandemic, you mentioned the last 2.5 years, it's now very well documented that horror movies have saved cinema. Horror movies are what people have been going to see. I think it depends on the people that you're talking to, whether or not they're going to like seeing a horror movie or not. They might go see a horror movie with a star in it. They might be seeing horror movies that have stars in them already. If they watch the Alien franchise, or they're already watching. But the thing that horror movies tend to do, because most of them are cheap, right? It's the way that people get into the business. It's a way that you can express yourself and get a large market. Yeah, the average budget isn't bad, but it's not great. Most people are found in horror films. What might be interesting to do is to go back and see how many A-listers started in horror movies. Almost all of them. Tom Hanks was in a horror movie. Matthew McConaughey was in a horror movie. Just about Clint Eastwood was in a horror movie. Jack Nicholson was in horror movies.
Chris Evans is, for lack of a better term, he is not his character, but if there ever was a personality he got close to matching Captain America. Because if you look at his Twitter, his Twitter is like 90%, look, I don't hate you because you're Republican, but there are some mistakes being made. I don't hate you because you're Democrat, but there are some mistakes being made. However, Trump is a fucking racist, and he's just like, he's embodying his own character on accident. This man wrote a screenplay for a horror movie that actually got released. I think it was House on Haunted Hill or something like that. And I was like, this is the last person I would ever think even cared about horror.
Yeah, comedians write horror movies. There's a very big audience between comedians and horror films. My podcast gets followed by a lot of comedy writers as well as horror writers because they obsess about this stuff. They love it, and they end up being uber fans, or they write their own stuff. But I think that you find that people find Jamie Lee Curtis, her whole career started with Halloween. Many of the A-listers of past and present work in horror at some point. They may not be proud of it. They may take it off of their thing, but it gets found out. And I think that's because horror movies not only are easily accessible, they're made very quickly. It's a way to get your foot in the door. But also, I mean, Jamie Lee Curtis had a very interesting thing to say about her role in Halloween, which was, for most of her career, that was the best character she ever played. The character was resourceful. Character was intelligent. Character stood for herself. She cared for others. She was able to speak with long lines of dialogue. She was able to hold scenes together on her own. She was top billed. She said, all of these things, I needed to go from emotions of pretending that I didn't see the monster to being terrified to being someone who cares more about the kids than me. All of that stuff, I'm getting an acting workout. And there are many actors and actresses from theater that go into horror films and they get a huge workout because there's a lot that can be done if you want to do it and if the director is ready for you to be able to do it. So there's something to be said that horror movies aren't where people go and just do dumb things. There are movies that are like that. I'm not going to say that there's not. But I also will say that there are dramas and movies that are romantic comedies that say even less about the human condition than some of the worst horror movies. So it's not endemic to the horror film. But I'm not sure if big names, of course, they'll always draw on whatever they do. That might get more people to watch, but more people are watching horror movies than they admit. It's almost like porn. I've seen that with like cinema friends of mine who are like, they know every movie made that was a foreign film from 2000 to 2020, and they have Directors Guild or Writers Guild cards and all this stuff. And then you go to their place and there's a horror movie and they're like trying to hide it like it's a dirty book. Oh, well, yeah, I was watching it. I really liked it. And I'm like, dude, there's nothing wrong. You're watching horror movies. They are art. They are entertainment.
That's the problem with stigmas. That is one of the biggest issues of any form of stigmatized media.
Yeah. See, this is the thing that I think is important. I do horror, right? But if you listen to my show, I use horror to talk about what's going on in the world, or I bring art films into the horror realm as well, because I believe that if I truly think that horror is a great art form, it should be able to stand toe-to-toe with other art forms. And so I don't pretend that the world of drama and Academy Award-winning films don't exist. I don't live in that vacuum. But what people respond to is not that I know a lot about horror movies, it's that it's personable. I don't hide myself from the stuff. I don't hide other people I don't hide the culture from the talk about horror films. I will use 4 or 5 horror movies to create an essay about something that's going on. I've done one about misogyny. I did do one about Uncanny Valley that I talked about before. I've talked about politics in some way. I've talked about fascism in some ways by using horror movies as examples. And I've also remembered to put myself in there because what I found out, and I found this out from going to conventions and stuff, people don't really go to conventions and just go to panels because the panel sounds interesting. They follow the people who are doing the panels. They find you interesting. They will find you out. They will look for you the next time through. And what that means is that you are what's important to your podcast. You're the ingredient no one else has. That personal passion, what I've been hearing in this conversation is so much more than what my expectations were when I read the list of questions that you asked me. I was like, okay, this sounds fine. But getting in here, I find the personality is what's important. I respond to passion. What makes me go is I find the like-minded people. Who are like-minded people? People who are passionate. I love people who can't just be bystanders. They can't just passively watch a Marvel film. They have to go out and cosplay afterwards. They have to talk about it. They have to make their own comic book. They are compelled. Yeah, they are compelled by passion to do more. Their love for the gift that they were given is to give gift in return. And that's where I'm not a hoarder. I am someone who I'm no good if I'm not telling people what movies they should be watching or ask them what's going on with them or getting into long conversations that go all night at conventions about what we love about whatever it is that gets us going.
Oh, I'm glad you said that because I know I'm not the only one.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Zach, for having me on. This has been great. This is, I mean, we really blew through the time. I haven't had one go this long in a long, long time. So this was a pleasure, and I thank you for having me on. And of course, if anybody's interested, they can find Hellbent for Horror, my podcast, on any of the podcast places that you would normally look, Apple, iTunes, all of that. If you're looking for the book, you can go to my website, hellbentforhorror.com, and on there, there's a book page. I also have a page of books that I recommend. And so a lot of the things that I've talked about today are listed there, and many, many, many that I didn't remember to put on there are also there. If you decide to get the book, you can get it through Amazon or Barnes & Noble and stuff like that. But on my webpage where my book is, if you're interested in helping out the small business person during this time of the pandemic, I have my ISBN number up there, which is the number for the book that any bookseller can get it ordered for you. Any bookseller that you know, especially the indies, the mom and pops, they'd be overjoyed to order a book for you through their place. So if you decide to do that, it's right there.
And I, as always, whenever we have a guest, I will try to make sure as many links as they want me to will be in the description for YouTube. And they'll also be in the comment section, as well as the description on any other platforms such as iTunes and Spotify, Verbal, all those people. So with that being said, I definitely appreciate it. I look forward to doing anything with you in the future. And I will see you when I see you. And much appreciated. And you give me hope for when I get old, because I want to, when I am old, I do not want to be a bitter Clint Eastwood hard ass. I want to be that almost like Cheech and Chong channeled vibe guy who just grew up with George Carlin but isn't as angry as George Carlin. And I appreciate you giving me that optimism to show me that it existed.